Good evening, everyone. Can find a seat. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jenna Weiss. I'm the manager of public programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, Dialogue and Discourse, Inspiring Contemporary Judaica, presented in conjunction with scenes from the collection. This program, the Lines of Distinction Lecture, has been endowed by Barbara and Benjamin Zucker in memory of Lottie and Charles Zucker, and by the late William W. Hallow, the late Susan Hallow Kalem, and the late Ruth Hallow Landman in memory of Dr. Gertrude Hallow. We have a number of upcoming talks, performances, and workshops connected to the new exhibition, so I just wanted to mention a few highlights. Next Thursday, April 26th at 7:30 p.m., please join us for a performance by Temecca Reed Quartet. It's our last Bang on a Can concert for the partnership this season. And on Wednesday, May 16th from 2 to 5 p.m., our next adult studio drawing workshop in the Signs and Symbols gallery space. For details about all of our upcoming public programs, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. Now I would like to introduce our speakers, beginning with Senior Curator Susan Braunstein. After her presentation, artists Amy Klein Reichert and Michele Okadoner will each speak briefly about their work, followed by a group discussion and questions from the audience. Susan Braunstein is Senior Curator at the Jewish Museum, where she is primarily responsible for the collections of historical and contemporary Judaica and antiquities. Dr. Bronstein has organized numerous exhibitions, including Israel in Antiquity from David to Herod, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Mysteries of the Ancient World, As It Were, So to Speak, a museum collection in dialogue with Barbara Bloom, and Repetition and Difference. Most recently, she was the coordinating curator for the museum's newly installed collection display, Scenes from the Collection, on view on our third floor galleries. Her fields of specialty include the archaeology of Israel and Hanukkah lamps, and in 2004, she published a catalog of the museum's entire collection of over 1,000 Hanukkah lamps. Amy Klein Reichert is an award-winning architect, exhibition designer, and designer of Judaica. Since 1996, when she won second place in the Philip and Sylvia Spertus Judaica Prize for her Seder plate, she has participated in invited juried exhibitions in museums around the world. Her work can be seen on display at the Jewish Museum in New York, the Jewish Museum in Vienna, the Yale University Art Gallery, and the San Francisco Contemporary Jewish Museum. She received her BA and Master of Architecture from Yale University and combines her studio work with teaching at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Michele Okadoner is an internationally renowned artist whose career spans 4 decades. Her artistic production encompasses sculpture, design objects, furniture, jewelry, public art, and video installations. She is well known for creating these public art installations throughout the United States and Europe, and her projects can be found in courthouses, public libraries, hospitals, museums, universities, as well as parks and major transportation centers. Okadoner's work can be found in the collections of numerous museums, including the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, to name a few. Now please take a moment in silencing your cell phones and join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Braunstein.
Good evening, all, and thanks for coming to the Jewish Museum. Our subject today is the inspirational forces that compel artists to create Jewish ceremonial art in the contemporary era. Focusing on age-old rituals or newly invented ones, artists add their own conceptual and artistic approaches that produce works that are not only functional, but often take Judaica in new and dynamic directions. This evening, I will begin the program with a brief historical overview of some of the key moments in the design of Jewish ceremonial art, beginning in the 1950s, when the museum played a seminal role in the field, and continuing through our 2 latest commissions from 2017. From the 1950s to the present, the design and symbolism of Jewish ceremonial art has been influenced by the confluence of many worlds and circumstances, from trends in art and design, and the artist's background and personal experience, to developments in the Jewish American community and beyond to the larger world stage. And these things I will hopefully bring out in my brief talk today. The conceptual, stylistic, and formal aspects of these objects were constantly changing and evolving with the times. These changes were inspired by the artists themselves, but also collectors, curators, and patrons were involved, giving new impetus to the field and to the performance of Jewish ritual. So I begin my review with 1956, when the Toby Pasher Workshop for the Design and Production of Modern Judaica was founded at the Jewish Museum. In this period, the Jewish community was recovering from the horrors of war, the devastation of the Holocaust, and rejoicing in the creation of Israel. Many Jews were able to move into the middle class and out to the suburbs, where they began building new and grand synagogues that needed ceremonial objects. Those involved in choosing these furnishings were interested in good design and new design that reflected the post-war era around them and that signaled the survival and the continued vibrancy of Judaism. To meet these needs, Abram Kanoff and his wife, Frances Pasher Kanoff, who were major collectors of Judaica, both historic and modern, decided to fund the creation of this Toby Pasher Workshop. Kanoff wanted to stimulate a new aesthetic approach to Judaica, something that was both original and uniquely American. He also hoped to provide a bridge to Judaism for those who had found no other way in. The museum invited Ludwig Yehuda Wolpert, who had fled his native Germany in the 1930s and went to Palestine, where he became the head of the silversmith department at the Betzalel School in Jerusalem, to head this new workshop. Wolpert's work had minimalist, elegant designs, such as this Seder plate, which he created in Frankfurt in 1930. Excuse me. The original was lost, and so there was a reproduction made in 1978 by the artist. Wolpert was one of the first designers to apply the principles of the Bauhaus to Judaica, as well as that of the Frankfurt School, where he was trained as a metalsmith. These principles included the fact that form should reflect function, works should be easy to reproduce, and objects should not have unnecessary ornamentation, especially of the surfaces. Wolpert's innovation was the Hebrew inscription. I'm going to try this. You can see here on the cup. His innovation to this aesthetic was the addition of inscriptions, usually cut out or applied to the surface, Hebrew inscriptions that represented biblical text or liturgical texts. And these both define the piece's function, if you can look at it as functional, as a ritual object, but they also expressed its sanctity through the use of these biblical expressions. Wolpert himself was deeply studied religion, and so he knew the text and was able to apply them in a very sensitive way. Over the years, I guess Wolpert died in 81, so from 1956 to 1981, Wolpert created many commissions for synagogues and private individuals. An example, sorry, this is the older version of my text, but that's okay. And you see here on the left is his iconic Hanukkah lamp, which was reproduced many, many times and bought by people all over the world. This sort of interlaced design is just very elegant and very modern. And on the right, you see an etro container that he created in this beautiful beaten silver with an inscription on the top. We're going to skip from the 1950s to the 1980s, which was a period stylistically of great experimentation in the form and materials of Judaica. These reflected postmodernist art world trends. These trends began to be manifested art in the 1960s and included a focus on subject matter rather than art for art's sake, an admiration for history and tradition, bringing back past styles in modern context, and the breakdown of the barriers between high and low arts and popular culture. And in the 1980s, when I began to study contemporary Judaica, I noticed that Judaica artists were now deconstructing the forms of ceremonial objects. They were challenging traditional rules and traditional shapes, and the works were often becoming sculptural as much as they were functional objects. And here you're seeing a Hanukkah lamp designed by Peter Shire, who is an LA sculptor and ceramicist, and he was a member of a group of designers called the Memphis School, I guess, which started in Milan under Ettore Sottsass. I'll show you a work of his soon. Shire's work includes pottery, sculpture, paintings, drawings, and furniture, and they all deliberately complicate the notion of functionality, and they blur the distinctions between fine art and design. When you look at this lamp, you're not quite sure if it's a Hanukkah lamp or not, but I can assure you that there are holes for candles on the tops of all the cubes and all the geometric shapes, and it is quite functional. Shire created a group of Judaica works in the mid-1980s and early 90s, and they were apparently commissions. We're trying to get to the bottom of the story. We haven't quite gotten it from him yet, but they seem to have been commissions from the museum at the Skirball Cultural Center in LA, and also commissioned from a local collector. During this period that he was doing these lamps, he also was exploring his own Jewish identity. His family was Jewish, but his parents, for some reason, raised them Episcopalian. I think it was a period after the war when a lot of people didn't want to show that they were Jewish. So they all knew that they were Jewish somehow. They would go to the cemetery and visit the Jewish cemetery and visit the family graves, but they all said that they were Episcopalian. But he finally, drew the wool from everyone's eyes and said, we're Jewish, and he started to explore his Jewish identity. So this piece defies Judaic law in the fact that Hanukkah lamps generally are supposed to have all the lights on the single row. I actually not being terribly observant before I got to the museum, I didn't know that fact, and it's possible that more secular Jews are not quite aware of that either, but this lamp, therefore, pulls apart the form and has the lights going in all different directions. It's really a gravity-defying piece which reflects all the trademarks of the Memphis style. It has unconventional materials like plastic laminates, kitsch patterns, gaudy colors, and geometric shapes assembled in odd juxtapositions. It incorporates Shire's enthusiasm for motorcycles and his intimate knowledge of their repair. He describes this lamp as almost an encyclopedia of machine techniques, including lathe work, counterboring, etc. And just to show you the school that he's working in, this is Ettore Sottsass's Carlton cabinet, and you can see these same principles at work, the bright colors. They were reacting actually to the kind of design aesthetic of the time, which was white carpeting, white couches, everything very pale, and so they just wanted explosions of color and things that were unbalanced and looked like they were falling down and ready to just fall into space. In the 1990s, in the art world, we see a newly expressed interest by artists in exploring their religious and ethnic identities after a long period of wanting to fit into the mainstream and not identify yourself as any kind of ethnic group or even gender. You were just all supposed to be artists. And the Jewish version of this was often provocative and strident. And the work was more of a self-critique, often against suburban middle-class values with which the artists were raised. And I'm showing here a work by Carrie Leibowitz, who is an artist who often uses text-based work that are both self-deprecating and critical of American consumer culture. In 1992, he created an exhibition with Rhonda Lieberman, which featured fake Chanel objects that explored the cultural stereotype of the American Jewish princess and her notorious need to shop. This skull cap is part of a series that Carrie Leibowitz made soon after that, which continues that exploration, but this time for the gay community. It imitates the Chanel style in the black and white satin, with its gold braid and its charms at top, but it's made from very cheap materials, and the skull caps were mass-produced but custom ordered. The piece skewers the gay Jewish middle-class obsession with shopping and brands. Shire intended this as a sculptural work. Carrie Leibowitz intended this as a sculptural work to be displayed in a museum or displayed in a home, and he was very surprised when men started buying them and wearing them to synagogues. So it was a work that he thought was a critique, which actually came to pass as being something that was quite usable. In the 21st century, Jews have been increasingly seeking individualized, non-communal ways into Judaism and how to blend it with being secular in a new technological age. According to a recent Pew study, more Jews feel identified through ancestry and culture than through religion. And around 2000, the beginning of this period, the Jewish Museum began expanding the scope of its Judaica collecting to include more conceptual works that incorporate or comment on ceremonial art in the context of explorations of Jewish ritual or identity. An example of this is the work by Beth Lippmann, which you see here. Lippmann is a sculptor who creates three-dimensional still lifes in glass, often based in 17th century painting tradition known as vanitas paintings. These displayed sumptuous foods and rich tableware, along with symbols that warned of the fleeting nature of life and the futility of material consumption. In 2012, the museum commissioned Lippmann to create a work for the collection. After looking through all the objects in the collection, she chose to create this piece, which incorporates reproductions of some of the museum's ceremonial objects, as well as her family mementos. And I'm just going to see if I can. So here you have a pair of candlesticks that are in the museum. It's hard to see because there's glass and it's see-through, but this is a beautiful carved wooden spice container for the end of the Sabbath. And this exquisite thing that's dripping down is a talit. It is based on her father's talit, or prayer shawl, executed in glass. She also added a large number of glass rocks of various sizes, which recall the Jewish tradition of marking a grave. When Jews go to visit a grave, they will always leave a stone to indicate that they had been there to visit. And you can see here a close-up. The piece is called Laid Table with, what is it, etro container and, etro container and pastry molds. And so here is the etro container that she used, and of course flowers, which are often an important part of vanitas paintings because flowers symbolize, the fleeting nature of beauty and life. The artist has said of this piece, "I considered the commission a portrait of myself in relation to my religion. The use of rocks to mark the objects will present an opportunity to contemplate our mortality in the face of tradition and faith. For myself, it is a way of confronting my identity as a Reformed Jew, acknowledging and literally marking a part of who I am. The rocks are symbolic of the foundation on which we build our future from what has come before. Although this is not a functioning ceremonial object, the act of thinking about and creating the work, as well as the inclusion of ritual art, inspired in the artist a deep interrogation of her connection to her Jewish identity, which one could say is an act of religious ritual in itself." A very different approach to one's religious identity is embodied in the work of Nicola Eisenman. Her work spans the absurd and the abject to the introspective and the irreverent, drawing on sources as varied as the iconography of classic myths and popular culture in general. This painting, which was also a commission for the museum, depicts a Seder. It includes a motley cast of characters exhibiting different reactions to participating in the ritual meal, from boredom to intense concentration, and it's executed in her often grotesque style. It actually represents members of her own family, with her mother opposite, the father holding the matzah, and brothers and sisters, and an aunt, brothers, and an aunt. Here, sorry, I can do that. We displayed this piece in a special focus essay show at the museum, and Nicole was involved in that display. And as part of that, we wanted to put some of our own Seder plates on view. So as she was looking through them, she became fascinated with them, especially the ones that had scenes of people in Seder, sitting at a Seder table. And she decided she wanted to create her own Seder plates, which we commissioned from her. So on the left you see one in which she took all of the characters and the colors and the grotesque images, and she put them around the rim, so the whole family is sitting here. And of course, the language is in English. And then on the right, she went a little bit further and just had the names of the foods, which are typically represented, not in English. You see bone, you see horseradish, you see bitter herbs, and then she goes to cementy stuff and not so bitter herbs. So you see that she uses these playful, childlike terms for the ritual foods and seems to be representing the viewpoint of a secular Jew who maybe doesn't remember the Hebrew names, but still wants to maintain their Jewish identity by creating and sitting at a Seder. This is one of the latest pieces that we commissioned for the collection by an artist, Arlene Sheckett, who's a sculptor. Her preferred materials are media that begin in liquid form and harden quickly, such as plaster, glass, and clay. And this piece is actually made out of gypsum and resin. The staff asked her to create a work for the collection, and she decided to focus on a pair of candlesticks that her grandmother brought with her to the United States when she left Belarus in 1920. These were the only material objects that her family has from their country of origin. The work, which is entitled Travel Light, depicts several pairs of candlesticks that had been shoved into a suitcase and wrapped with a strap. It combines sculpture and functionality because Sheckett intended it to serve as Sabbath candlesticks, and that's why there are candles in it ready to be lit. Sheckett's work often subtly intertwines acts in the past, present, and future. So in this project, the process of learning about the history of the candlesticks led her to track down previously unknown relatives and documents, including her grandmother's passport, the cover of which is embedded in the work, as you see there. 3 more editions of the work are planned, and Sheckett will ask each future owner to give her a cherished family record, which she will also embed in the piece. Thus, Travel Light will accumulate new stories as a suitcase acquires travel labels, embracing the future as well as the past. And the last piece I wanted to bring to your attention is another one which we just commissioned in 2017. And this is a marriage contract by a Nigerian-American artist named Ruby Onyinyeche Amanze. And here we see that it was the museum shop that actually stimulated the commission. The museum does sell reproductions of our marriage contracts, just the borders, and then a couple will buy it and put their own text inside. And they realized that we didn't have any good contemporary ketubot or marriage contracts to sell. And so we decided to approach some artists to design them. And Amanzi was one of them, with the hope that artists from other cultures would interact with our own Jewish culture and come up with something beautiful. Amanzi practices a lot of it is with drawing, which she does very sensitive drawings with delicate pencil work and color, and often she provides titles for them which have social or poetic commentary, and these seem to be kind of perfect for this kind of romantic, beautiful marriage contract which we were envisioning. So she based her work on the traditional Jewish contract with the frames and the borders, which is designed to protect the wife financially in the event of divorce or her husband's death. But she takes the work into the present by exploring how 2 separate people can unite as a couple while still maintaining their individuality. Her eloquent text begins, "I celebrate you, I learn you, I will protect your magic." And there are areas in the contract where there are splits and cutouts, like here and here, which to her represent the 2 separate people coming together. The artist also focuses on the diversity of peoples within Judaism, which is represented by the ambiguous central couple with their not quite human skin colors and patterns, and an elaborate hairstyle, which is here, of one of the figures that is actually based on that worn by Igbo women of Nigeria. It is actually an Igbo tradition to claim descent from one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And Amanzi only mentioned to me when the work was finished that members of her own family identify with Judaism. Her Igbo father wears a Star of David, and her sister practices certain Jewish rituals, which I didn't even know. So I picked a winner, but I didn't know how much connection she had to Judaism. She kept that close to the vest. And just to show you some of the influences that are on the artist, she does appropriate images that she likes, and then she transfers them, and then she modulates them. She liked this photograph by George Hoyningen-Hunef called The Divers from 1930, and she felt that they were very intimate, the way they were sitting, and they were looking out confidently into this unknown future, much like a married couple would do. And so that's why she chose that. But also, she uses other symbols such as plants, which represent home to her. She moved around a lot, so that's very domestic for her, and constellations as connectivity. This ketubah took on special meaning for her when she became engaged to be married while she was working on it. So while she was thinking about her own union, she was able to ponder the text that she was going to include, and the two became one. So in our brief journey this evening, we've traveled from Wolpert's elegant, unornamented Seder plate to Eisenman's playful work, reflecting a more humorous approach to Jewish identity and practice in 2015. Over the decades, the new developments in ritual art signaled a transformation from strictly functional objects that engendered a sense of Jewish community and commonality to multivalent art objects that expressed an artist's highly personal and complex attitudes and relationships to Judaism. In addition to the artist's own creativity, we can see how Jewish communities, collectors, and curators have played a role in stimulating new Judaica through the establishment of workshops, invitational exhibitions, and commissions for synagogues and museum collections. Throughout the 60 years covered, what is perhaps most heartening to me is the continuous desire by artists to make ceremonial art, whether it's in the practice of Jewish ritual or to express the Jewish identity that was relevant in a changing world. Thank you. Amy?
Great, so nice to be here tonight. And Susan and I last worked together years ago creating the current or still present children's exhibit on archaeology. So it's fun to be here again tonight. And for years, I was one of the picture moms at my kids' school, meaning that I would come in every few months and talk about a piece of artwork. And around the holidays, it was often my own artwork. So in the freewheeling, terrifyingly so, Q&A that usually followed these presentations to third and fourth graders, one young kid asked me, are the four sides of your Seder plate stand for the four sons or the four questions of the Hagaddah? And I said quickly, yes, because I actually had never thought about that before. And that's one of the true pleasures of creating artwork, is that you send these things out into the world, and it's really fun to see what they come back with, layered with, and what reactions people have. And so from then on, I always say that the four-sided design was completely based on the four questions and the four sons, so it can be a very useful tool as well. The purpose of every... Four cups, too. There you go. I'll say that from now on, too. Four children, sorry. So the purpose of every object on the Seder table is really to help us to imagine ourselves into the story. And so that kid was really onto something, because the rabbis really felt that in putting these props on the Seder table and in creating the script of the Hagaddah, the main impetus for that was to prompt questions from everybody at the table, young, old, learned, unschooled, etc. So every Judaica object, to me, is an opportunity to translate our tradition of texts into the visual, physical world. And there are many ways that we can facilitate that translation, but in this particular project, I was very interested in the literary structure of the Hagaddah and how that could be translated into visual form. So as many of you may know, the Hagaddah is actually a collage of elements from Torah, Talmud, Midrash, meaning legends and storytelling, and folk songs. And its telling of the story of the Exodus is emphatically non-linear. It jumps all around. There are changes in scale, changes in characters, disrupted time. And so I wanted the very form of this Seder plate to maybe I'll go back, to actually reflect that collage-like quality. So unlike many Seder plates, modern and traditional, that treat all the foods with a kind of equivalence and have a sort of round form, I really wanted to depart from anything that would look like the fine china of the Seder table, like the one on the upper left, and treated the foods as equal when they each had such different symbolic import. The Seder plate also has a plate to hold matzahs in it and has integral handles so that it's almost like a little package or suitcase, which also recalls the hurried flight from Egypt into freedom that it is supposed to express on the holiday. The other thing that's really exciting about designing Judaica to me is that as well as embodying stories in visual form, it's a chance to kind of excavate and explore the idea of performance, because after all, these are always props in a kind of ritual performance. So, for instance, when you set the Seder plate, you trowel the haroset into brick-shaped compartments, thereby echoing with your own body the act of slavery, of making bricks and mortar of the Jews enslaved in Egypt. On the left-hand side, so that's over here. On the left-hand side, I had always tried to solve this problem of the rather limp-looking parsley that just at the moment you point to it during the Seder kind of is lying there lifelessly when it's supposed to express spring green. So instead, I made it into a little orchard to sort of, and you plant the trees as you're setting the table, again, embodying that idea of rebirth and springtime green. And then as a practical solution, below the silver plate that holds the orchard, there's a damp piece of cheesecloth that kind of sustains it during the Seder, solving that dehydration kind of problem. So getting back to that question of the four sides, I had really thought of this as a kind of frame, and that's where the shape came from. The Spanish philosopher and cultural critic Ortega y Gasset called a frame an aperture of unreality that opens magically onto us in our real world. And I thought that perfectly expressed this idea of a window into another time and place that nonetheless penetrates the world of today at our Seder table. The Seder plate, when it's empty, really should have traces and sort of fossil-like ability to evoke the objects that have been there before and the foods that will be put there the next year. So I wanted a plate that even when it was clean, its very impressions kind of evoked what was there last year and what will be there again next year. I'm very interested, as well as embodying stories, with the idea of Judaica objects that change state to express the sort of change of state that ritual acts associated with them do. So just briefly, on the left are Shabbat candlesticks that are closed buds during the week, and then on Friday night they blossom and allow you to light Shabbat candles, bringing in the sacred time. On the right-hand side is a pair of Kiddush cups for twin boys that, when used, you separate them, thereby enacting that act of separation that marks the quotidian time of the week from the sacred time of Shabbat. Thinking about that as well in a larger scale object, I wanted to share with you a recent commission right around the corner from here. It's a new ark for a chapel in a new education building of the Park Avenue Synagogue on 89th Street. I just want to talk for a minute about the kind of programmatic requirements that help generate the form of this Torah ark. When we talk about program in architecture, it usually is thought of as a kind of functional brief. You know, how big does something have to be? How many people does it have to hold? What possible office versus public spaces are there? So it's a very pragmatic kind of document. But what's so interesting to me about designing Judaica is that built into that program, there are functional considerations. How much wine does a Kiddush cup have to hold? How many candles does a menorah have to hold? But there's also a kind of poetic program. It's always supposed to point us to something higher and take us out of our kind of daily lives as an essential part of its function. So some of the practical parameters with this ark were that it had to be partially buried in the wall because of space constraints. And because it's a multi-purpose space, it had to have a rather low-key atmosphere so that it didn't really read as a big sacred object in a multi-purpose space when something else was going on there. It also, though, had to have a big ta-da moment when you opened it so that it would sort of anchor the room during prayer services and refocus people's attention on that east wall. One of the main generators of the form is that this is an ark in a chapel in an education building. And I was very interested in the idea that every Hebrew letter has a symbolic function, and the word for limud, lamed, the Hebrew letter lamed stands for limud, which means learning. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of use that letter as a motif for the doors of the ark, so that literally not only did it echo the educational function of the building, but when you broke the lamed and you opened it up, you were opening up learning based on our sort of ur text of the Torah. So it sort of hammered that home every time you would open and close the ark itself. Another fun aspect of this ark that I wanted to play with was that the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, had to be integral to the ark, again, because of the multi-purpose nature of the room. So in reading a lot of Midrash and traditional Jewish texts, I saw some interpretations that a Ner Tamid is not only the sort of flame on the altar that was eternally kept going by the high priest, but also is a tzohar, which is a kind of sapphire-like stone which was created before creation, and also was the material of the ark window in Noah's Ark. So I thought it would be really fun to play with the idea of a sapphire window as part of this ark, and it's a double window. There's a window in the ark, and then the light fixture itself has a kind of twinkling LED starry lights within it as the light source inside. The motifs of the grill are derived from architectural motifs of the 87th Street Main Park Avenue Synagogue building, so it's a link to the campuses. That was a desire of the congregation as well. The gold interior of the ark recalls the gold interior of the original ark talked about in the Torah that traveled with the Israelites and carried the Ten Commandments tablets with them on their journeys through the desert. And this is a familiar object. I'm very pleased to see that it's right next to Ludwig Volpert's beautiful Seder plate in the permanent exhibit. And I'll just talk for a minute about Miriam's cups. Miriam's cups are a new object kind of generated in the 80s at feminist Seders. And something that I like to emphasize is that while creating a Miriam's cup and using it was a kind of radical feminist act at the time, the idea that there's a new object that helps us tell the story and prompt questions is completely consistent with the rabbi's desire for what a Seder should be about. So far from being a radically different object, it's just a radically new way of asking those same questions and retelling that same story. The elements that make up this are the shape itself is a hemisphere, so it's bottomless in a sense, and when someone bangs the table, it kind of shimmies and becomes an instrument, a tambourine. So that bottomless aspect was derived from the idea that Miriam's well was a bottomless well of living water that sustained the people of Israel in the desert. The symbols are held up by reed-like forms that recall Miriam as an actor in the Bible rescuing Moses from the bulrushes to then propel the whole story forward. And of course, most famously, Miriam's song at the sea, her dance and song with the women with the tambourine. So I tried to pack as much as I could into this object, which was a bit of a challenge because my process always starts with really trying to mine traditional texts for what the halachic legal requirements and what the tradition of an object has been throughout our history. And this, of course, is a new object. There were it could hold anything. It could be as big or as small as you wanted. It was just to express Miriam. So that's really what sort of generated the forms. So I'd just like to close with a quote from Moshe Zabari, who's a wonderful Judaica artist who was at the Toby Pasher workshop for, I think, almost 30 years. And it's something that I always have in mind when creating Judaica. He said, "If the object is an old one, we will tend to think of the ceremony as an old one which does not require our contemporary participation. And more significantly, these stylized forms, meaning the old stuff, become symbols. We will be worshiping the ritual piece and forgetting the ceremony." So I think there's a real drive to, in every generation, create a new language that draws on this amazing well of tradition that we have, but helps to move things forward for our day. Thank you.
Here we go. Going backwards here. That was very impressive. I'm so impressed by her Jewish education. Even though I had one as well, it was much more, I'm going to say, secular, and but very deep within me also. What you see here is or you don't see it yet, is a teething ring it's a physics spiral, and I was asked to do a Miriam's Cup, which is what connects me to the Jewish Museum materially. And I was asked to connect it to my practice, and that wasn't very hard, because though I don't participate in many rituals, the wonderful legacy and the teachings and the songs, the psalms are always with me. Even in something as small as a baby gift, the physics spiral really evokes many things I loved and read in Genesis, and I still reference the Bible and especially the Psalms in many ways, as you'll see. The spoon, now the spoon went back to the notion of serving, and this one is a particularly interesting spoon in that I decided that to serve was a spiritual and physical gesture as well as material. So that spoon is this long, and the cup is the shape of my hand, and the shaft goes from my wrist bone to my elbow. Now, where I got that notion was I'm always referencing the Garden of Eden. Now, I was born and raised in Miami Beach, so it wasn't too difficult when we were reading the Bible to think about the 7 species, because many of them were growing around me. Not pomegranates, but just about everything else. I was in Easter Island, and there was a feast, and the people were going somewhere down the road, and I followed them. And it was a very small village, and it had been raining for days, so everybody went out. And then I saw them serving, and I saw them moving, and I saw in a place that was full of mud and not too much civilization what ceremony and eating was about. And ceremony and the ceremonial life is something that is grounded in the home, and I consider the home different than the vernacular space. For me, it's always been sacred space. And many of these things, I think, have come down to me by respect that my parents had for their home and their parents, which I think is generational. This spatula is also very oversized, and it came with the idea of serving up life large, which is just a wonderful, optimistic and aspirational tool. I used it for strudel especially, and Thanksgiving. I always make a wild mushroom strudel. So you could see I'm working, these are also forks, with tools that when I was asked to do a Miriam's Cup, it wasn't so removed from my vocabulary. These particular silver pieces, and we were talking earlier about making. I'm a maker. I don't send it to a fabricator. I do everything but cast it myself, but then I get the castings and I have to work them and do the patina and do the shaping. And these came from a natural object I found. I always wondered what Eve would have used. And I had a fabulous tree that's still growing that is as big as this room. It's a banyan tree across from the house I was raised in. And once I went to a costume party as Eve, and I took the leaves from the banyan tree, and I must have been about 9 years old, and I sewed them together. And of course, when I lifted it, the threads tore the leaves, and I began to cry. And we had a housekeeper called Blanca, and she shook her head, and she went in my closet and took a slip and put it in and tacked it, and I went to the party as Eve. So leaves, trees, sticks, all these things have been part of my vocabulary and part of my practice. This is a crater bowl. And this is quite large. It's silver. It sits in my kitchen. It's 2 feet in diameter, 24 inches, and it's filled with seasonal things, a celebration of life itself. I wish it was filled with avocados, but it's rarely, because they go so quickly. But, you know, in the fall, I buy those crates of mandarin oranges, and it has to do with a life process and continuum again. You know, the volcano and the sense of lava and movement and the earth always changing. And I've always loved geology. And these spoons were a commission. These are like operculum spoons. I don't know if you know what operculum is, but it's the door that a gastropod slams shut when a creature comes to eat it. So, you know, it's a keratin, just like our hair and nails. And I used to find the little shells when I was a child and collecting them. And I happened to have one, and then a little piece of also a reed, and that's how these were made. And this is a platter, and again, what I call from an Eden motif made of 2 palms fronds that I cut and put in juxtaposition. So this is also very, I'm going to say, quote unquote, Jewish in that the Garden of Eden, sure, they didn't cast them in silver, but they had all of these raw materials, and that's what they used when they served things up. The vase, this is also palm. And this I made because I was in somebody's garden one morning, and they were away, but they said, anytime you want, I know you love my garden, you can come and take, flowers. So I went, and even though I had been invited, I felt like I snuck in, and I really took a lot of flowers. Well, I had only 2 hands. So I looked at this palm tree, it was low, and I made it cut, and I made a funnel, and then I took everything back with me. So I thought, well, that's how they carried things. So I then took the palm frond and didn't want it to dry out, and I took paper towels and newspaper, kept it damp, took it back to New York, covered it with wax and worked it. And the interesting thing was I also took a lot of roots thinking it would hold the piece up, but it never had the strength, so I had to take wax and formulate a bottom. Now, this is also was a commission, this private commission for a ritual cup, and it's made with roots. Of course, you can't see the roots per se because, it all needed to be pulled together, so that's wax. And I was saying earlier that I was pulling wax out of my fingers on the way up here. It's a wonderful material, and it's wonderful to work. And this connects me also to a heritage, because as I went through Damascus many years ago, and I've been in Morocco, they always take me to the Jewish quarter, and I see the shops of the silversmiths. And of course, when I was in Syria and Damascus, it was an empty quarter. And but it was fascinating to know, and of course, the Yemenite silver, the Yemenite jewelry is just fantastic. So here is the Miriam's cup. I was thinking, well, what would Eve have used? So I wasn't thinking of Miriam at the moment, always Eve somehow. And I guess all those paintings of Adam and Eve made an impression. And one of my first lithographs was titled Adam and Eve When They Were Young. And it was really two silly creatures. It was, but very exuberant. So this comes from palm. They would have had this material. It's been worked. You'll never find such a beautiful piece of palm. It's part of the frond. It's the part that hugs around the tree trunk to hold on. And always when I would walk by them and see them filled with water after a rain, I understood they were natural containers. So I went to Nymphenburg. I was invited. I've shown you a lot of work in silver. My graduate degree is actually in ceramics. And I studied with people who came with Saarinen from Finland and built Cranbrook in Michigan. And they really brought with them tradition of making from raw, simple materials, simple things. And I was invited by Nymphenburg outside of Munich by a new director about 15 years ago, who said that the kilns were not used anymore, and they'd been used by the Nazis for gloves, and they'd been used by the SS to make china. And he actually said, what would you do with them? So first of all, he took me to the Jewish Museum in Munich, and they had a very battered cup that I read the text that was a ritual cup. Well, I'd never seen one where you hold it by two handles that are not equal distance, and then you wash, which I've never had done. So the first thing I did is designed a product for them based on that cup, based on their own clay, made the handles gold. You won't believe what I'm going to say next, for their new Turkish immigrants who would use them. So they would reach beyond the bourgeois and the royal aspect and embrace the other that they had now. Of course, they never made them, needless to say, but they did give me the use of two kilns. We did great exhibitions. You can see the kiln room. And I did soul catchers. And that was a really beautiful, very evocative exhibition. There's a detail. And simple, just earth and iron oxide. And looking into the second kiln, you see a figure half buried. You see this piece is called Distraught Goddess and Her Prophecy. See the other part of the kiln. Now look at that, was from the New York Times, taken from Iraq, a grave builder. This is going back about 10 years, the Iraqi war. I couldn't believe when I saw that how it looked like what I had done in the kiln. And it certainly made me aware of what, the Jungians called the collective consciousness. This is a burning bush that's in the kiln room. It's upstairs in the kiln room. And there's a staff, a very magical staff propped against the wall. And the Duke himself came and loved it and threw me a wonderful dinner in the palace. This is a Goliaths Crown. Don't ask me where I get the titles from. They're just there. And I love this piece. I've lived with this. Is it sculpture? Yes, but in the interior, I hang grapes during certain seasons. I use it on the table all the time. And this is a drawing from this Center for Jewish History. I was commissioned to add something very quickly because the building seemed very barren when they finally got done with it, and they didn't have a big budget. And I had seen floor of an ancient synagogue, and I saw the relics of it in a shop in California, and they were lead pieces that were flattened, of course, and I was told they were from the book of Job. So this is before instant anything. I said, could you just give me a picture of this, send this to me? Yes, they could, and they did. So when this commission came up, I said, I have just the perfect thing from this old synagogue, this idea of these letters, and I brought it to the meeting, and when I said it was the book of Job, no, nobody thought, they thought it was bad luck. So I ended up doing the 7 species, and here's the proposal drawing, and here's the atrium with the grapes. And what I learned was I couldn't mix the pieces. I couldn't put the wheat and the barley near the grapes, and then I realized orchards are separate from the fields, and even visually, it just wasn't working. So these are the wheat fields, and this comes from an Egyptian tomb drawing, and it's such a beautiful drawing, and it's a bird's eye view of and flattened, of how the wheat was growing. And there's the palm frond, the palm tree. And this is an installation in Detroit, 1978, page 1 and page 2. So you see the connection to my body of work is what you've seen is sort of part of what I do. This is a larger connection, my interest in archaeology, geology, evolution, sedimentary layers, all of these things come out in exhibitions. So this one's called Burial Pieces, and I actually went on an archaeological dig in Israel, 1980, Tel Anafa, with the University of Michigan. The year before, they had found a lot of glass, and they were looking for an ancient furnace. They were convinced, and it wasn't very far from where the Phoenicians, who were the great glass, creators from the fires on the sand, had begun the whole art of casting and making and blowing glass. Speaking of sedimentary layers, this is a floor of the Laredo courthouse. I did this about 10 years ago. So you see the scope of work after looking at my ritual cup and my forks. All those things are how I live, how I want to celebrate a personal life that has ritual and history and content. And these are the large public projects. This is at Herald Square. This was a proposal drawing, Radiant Sight it was called. I won a national competition proposing to create an inversion. You descend into light instead of darkness. And I won, and it was such a strange idea. There are 11,000 gold luster tiles. These were made in Detroit at the last arts and crafts pottery, Pewabic, which is still existing. And then here's a piece that is made from roots. And this is, again, this was shown in a gallery in New York, yet when I was asked by a curator to propose some works of art for an exhibition in Amsterdam on the Golem, I had no problem finding enough dozen things to send right away from a contemporary body of work. So here's Sargassa. She's a print. This is 8 feet tall, made with pressed seaweeds. And here, pressed roots are on these pieces. These are from Nymphenburg. So the ritual objects and the quote-unquote art, I don't make any separation. I make everything. Some goes in an art gallery, some went in the subway station, some goes on my table at night. And it's really a wonderful way to live. It's integrated, it's honest, and it's not catering to a marketplace. It's really about respect, about ceremony, and about a way of life that we are so lucky that our ancestors have helped carve out for us, and that's why we're here tonight. This is Miami Airport, and I had such a large canvas there in the floor, just so many thousands of square feet. So this I call cosmic. I could really explore all the ideas, some of which I've mentioned, of how we live, of the cosmos, of the past, of the future. The white has seeds, and yet I stuck in a little automaton. Some of my work is very, very playful and even whimsical at times, and others is very, I would say, pushing scholarship, trying to figure things out. And finally, this is a joint this is a 55-foot in diameter, what the terrazzo guy calls a knuckle. It's a circular space, and there are 4 of them at the airport. And I had to combine the white floor and the black floor. And so I went into hurricanes, but also into galaxies, and it's all one thing. So the county was very upset because Hurricane Andrew had just happened right at the same time, which, we hadn't had a hurricane in Miami in 30 years. But it was, I kept saying, no, it's a galaxy, which it is. So it's wonderful to be commissioned. It pushes you, it encourages you, it challenges you. And essentially, though, the end of all of it, you find, and I'm sure, Amy, you do too, you feel useful, you feel you have a skill, you've learned it on the shoulders of many, and it all comes back to that spoon you serve. Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you for an amazing revelation of your practice, of how you think about Judaica in 2 very different ways, but somehow still infused with the same kind of spirituality and overall approach. I'm filled with questions. I'm going to ask a very specific question of you just about the piece that you made for the Jewish Museum, the Miriam Cup. Did you go shopping looking for that palm frond for us, or was it one that you already had?
No, I went foraging. So to find the right scale, how it would sit in one's hand, and it's a very unique piece. I don't come across that or that scale. I guess I'm not looking for it either.
But Okay, I just wondered if you collect, because I know you collect so many pieces from nature and you have them all around, and didn't know if you just pulled one out from the closet or it was very specific to us.
It's all very specific. In fact, I've been collecting, I realized when you put up the Hebrew letter that I've been developing my own alphabet all these years.
I want to ask you also a very specific question about the original Seder plate, which we also have in the Jewish Museum collection. When one of our curators looked at it, they felt it really was inspired by a bento box, a Japanese bento box. So you talked about how everybody brings their own ideas to things that you have created. Was that at all in your mind when you were making it?
I guess the kids' version was the 4-question. The adult version of that has been a bento box for several people. So while it would have made sense, and my kind of aesthetic education really started in some ways in Japan. I worked there right after college, and I've always really loved Japanese design, and I imagine that's something that Michele and I share. It's funny, and it's a sort of artistic truism to say, like, well, it just happened, but it kind of did. Like, it ended up being a bento box, but that was not the starting point. So I guess in a way, when you're thinking about collaging foods and everything having its own shaped space, it's a logical analogy, but it didn't start out that way, even though it had every reason to start out that way.
I guess it refreshed my mind about how everything gets put together, and I was so totally impressed by the parsley, that you really thought about, how you could keep it fresh, and I didn't realize that in the manufacture. We heard a little bit about from Michele about her process of manufacture, and how you really are hands-on, and although the only thing that you mentioned, the only thing that you don't do is the casting itself, but there's so much before and after that you do. What about your process of being an architect? Is there something different about it?
I'm very jealous of Michele's skill set of being able to do so much of the fabrication. I really collaborate with fabricators and artisans, and I do a lot of the finishing work myself, but it's the very easy stuff at the end. So I make a lot of models. I draw a lot. I really believe in drawing as a means of understanding the world, and I make a lot of models out of paper and aluminum foil and scrap stuff, and then I would take those to an artisan, a silversmith, or a stonemason or wood guy, and work out things with them. And in the process, I learned a lot about probably one of the more complicated fabrication pieces were the twin Kiddush cups, because it involved olive wood, which is actually not a very stable wood. It has a very high oil content, which helps it, but the grain of it that we were trying to get was very complicated, and it expands and contracts at a different rate than sterling silver, so there had to be a flexible connection. So they're like little more complicated than buildings sometimes, making these tabletop sized things, but I always rely on the expertise of craftsmen who teach me a lot and help it evolve, really.
I was wondering how much of what's going on in the world or in your personal lives gets folded into the objects that you make at any particular time, say?
I've always made what I've needed, because I can't find things that, I had wanted. More today, there's so many people making things, but you've seen probably 50 years of my work there. There's an accumulation. I mean, the baby, the teething ring with the physics spiral, just a small objects I started with. I always write on the card something like, so the baby can grab hold of the universe. I never found a baby gift I liked, so, I make what I need. So
at the time,
very personal. I think I really expressed that it was driven, the body of celebratory and daily objects are driven by ritual and by a need to have honored a woman's life, a domestic life, a domestic landscape, I'll call it, which I thought had become trivialized in some way by the time it was, the 60s when I married.
Yes. Amy, what about you?
I guess in the sense of being sort of political art or responding to immediate circumstances, I always found it very moving. I have a son who's a cellist and went through the Suzuki program. And these Suzuki teachers would always say, human beings are really lousy at lots of things. They're really bad at politics and taking care of each other. But art is something that we do really well, which is why you should always play music. And I think that art is a world in which, first of all, we have a degree of control that we don't of the outside world. And it is a kind of respite and a sort of thing that human beings have done really well for millennia, where we've really messed up a lot of other things. So I think in that sense, I view it as kind of pursuing something that human beings are good at.
And something that's kind of timeless and lasts, and it's not thrown about by all the craziness in the world outside. Do you have anything you would like to ask each other?
I'm just a big fan of Michele's work.
But, I do think, interestingly enough, that the making a large silver bowl, making a spoon, I think it was a political statement, but I always said I was a stealth warrior. I didn't want to take on feminism. I was so busy, raising a family, doing my work. I didn't have time to march, but I felt so good about the role of a woman in the world. And, I had a very intelligent mother. It was self-respect that built that collection. And yesterday I had the privilege of being at Bard for their Iris Awards. A friend of mine received one. And they said that the decorative arts, and I don't even like that word, the decorative arts, it sounds lesser. They said it mitigates humanity, people, and architecture. Between us and buildings, you have objects. And the need for that, we need things, we need them to aid us in our daily life, and we need them to satisfy us in other ways, and they should be elevated and not trivialized. So I felt your bento box was what I thought it was. Also gave a very contemporary and serious edge. So I think I preferred in that to the more playful things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, there's a place for that too, I think. As you say,
for everything,
you want to engage people in the Seder, in the rituals, and whether it's done through humor or whether it's done through seriousness. I think it all works. Just depends on where you're at and what you want. What is there? One other question I wanted. I was impressed by what you both bring in terms of spirituality to your work. Michele, you admit that you don't have a lot of education, formal Jewish education. It's more secular, but still there's a wonderful spiritual, universal quality to what you do. But Amy, I'm totally impressed by the way that you really study the texts. And so do you have a strong background or upbringing in that? How do you come to that?
I grew up, I identified with the conservative movement, and then became more observant about 30 years ago and took on more or less Orthodox practice. And I think the objects are, again, a sort of mediating force. It's a great way in because for me, they have the quality of being non-denominational. They can speak to everyone, and they can speak to beginners and advanced people, and it's beyond and before language in some ways. And so I found that Jewish ritual objects are ways that people can have conversations across denominations that they can't always do with texts, because sometimes they don't feel that they share a text. As I've said before, there's no such thing as a beginner's mezuzah and an advanced mezuzah. You sort of enter it wherever you are, and you can find meaning in it. So I find that very powerful. But to echo something Michele said, my first Seder plate, which is the first time I ever thought about doing Judaica, was basically because I could never find a Seder plate I liked. So I thought, worst comes to worst, I just have this really expensive Seder plate. But at least it's one I can use, that speaks to me.
And that was, I guess, a follow-up question is, what do you use at home? Do you make things for yourself like Michele does, or do you? Yeah. So a lot of.
So I use this one, and I also have a second one that that I use as well. So.
All right. I wish I could do that. I am the scholar. I cannot make anything. I'm a disaster. So I just respect both of you to be able to think of all those aspects, whether it's how to make the wood work with the silver, or how to make the spoon that has the shape and size of your hand. I'm going to throw it open to the audience now for any questions. Anybody?
Yeah, great.
Oh, Jenna's going to do that.
I'm actually very curious about how you decide what you want to commission for the museum, in the sense that, it seems like the issue of authenticity versus cultural interchange is an issue. And when you talk about this Nigerian, ketubah, it makes me question why the Jewish Museum is doing something like that. And also, I understand why we want to be infusing the ritual with current, and future possibility, but we also want to look back on what the original roles were. So I guess, in a long-winded way, that's my question.
Well, I guess the first thing I want to say in terms of other cultures interacting with Jewish, that there is a very, very long history of non-Jewish artisans making Judaica. There are parts of the world in 17th, 18th, 19th century where Jews were not allowed to work in the silver guilds, etc. So there was a collaboration between the makers and the patrons, the people who were working that. We commission from all walks of life. We've commissioned from Michele, and we haven't commissioned works, but we've bought them. We look everywhere for the most innovative Judaica. We are interested in people who are just pushing the boundaries in design, in concept, etc. And so we occasionally do step away and out to other artists just to see what will happen when we combine our two cultural approaches. We were very pleased with the results of the ketubah. I showed it to our shop manager because the whole reason why we did this was to be able to sell it to Jewish couples. They absolutely adored it. They thought it was gorgeous. And we work with the company called ketubah.com, and they were actually the impetus for the whole thing. They kept saying, don't you have any contemporary ketubot? And they are going to be reproducing it. And so, Jewish couples will be using this design by a very sensitive woman from another culture who was very interested to interact with us and to step outside of her own. She says, I'm always being branded as a black artist, and I want to step out of that too. So we're looking everywhere for it. I have to say that in recent years, I've not been very excited by the Judaica that's been made by Jewish Judaica makers. They seem to be, they do wonderful work, but they seem to be not progressing in terms of making something that's new. And that's kind of what we're always looking for. So that's, I guess, the long answer to the long question.
This is from Michele. When you did the Burning Bush series recently, I think it's recently. When you did the Burning Bush series, did you first think of the title, or you created it and then said, Burning Bush?
I first made it and then titled it. But what was so strange about the piece, and I didn't have an opportunity to find the slide I don't think I showed one tonight, did I? No, of a burning bush.
Did you want me to go get the...
There was one.
Oh yes, there was one, that's right, in the kiln. I've made a lot of burning bushes over the years. But the first one I made was long time ago, and we hung it up at the foundry so to make sure the cups were level. And it was a late November, early December night, and we lit it to see. We put candles in, and then we lit it, and somehow the whole foundry came around it. And then when I got home, my older sister had a message on my tape. Remember the voice machines? And she said, "Tonight's the first night of Hanukkah." Now that I couldn't believe. So, secular we're raised. That said, how much really, what do we know at the end of the day? It's such a deep and wonderful heritage. And, I just filled with gratitude and very happy to be here tonight.
I actually had a question about that because I had seen one of your burning bushes shown at HUC downtown in a Judaica exhibition, and I guess I assumed that they were passing it off or saying it was a Hanukkah lamp. Was it not?
No, I think, was it Laura Kruger, the curator?
Yeah.
She knew I made them, and so she said, she told me what she was doing, and I said, sure, you can have it. She actually took mine because I didn't have any. And so, and I don't know, I didn't see the show, but it
Right,
was
I don't
fine.
remember. I think I just assumed that they were saying it was a Hanukkah lamp because everything else was a ceremonial object. But so I was curious to know if anybody used them that way, or do you use one?
I made one for a friend who's a major collector who wanted a menorah. But I didn't do them level. I never heard of that until tonight.
Right.
A couple things I learned tonight I never heard of, and that's one. And then I did know to make, what is it called, a shamus? The one candle.
Higher.
Yeah, you brought a lot back to me, And so that I did do that, but I've never made a menorah.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah, part two. Well, part two is separate from part one. In this particular floor that you made, and in the spirograph, I should do it closer here. In this particular floor, and in the spirograph series that you did, is there some feeling of a life force that you have? I mean, there's marvelous energy.
Always there's a life force. I think that's what life is. It flows through us, and artists metabolize it and express it visually. But, you see it especially, you want to see a visual life force that comes out of a book, is Isaac Bashevis Singer. I mean, he says, what is life but a dance among graves? We were thinking about, and what was interesting about the stones on Beth's table is I was always taught that the stones were placed on headstones to remind us we were a desert people, because when somebody passed away and you buried them in the sand and people then went on, the hyenas were waiting. So instead they had to throw stones on to, and that is where it comes from.
I had no idea.
I didn't either.
I'm sort of following up on this lady's comment. I was looking at the Hanukkah menorah, but that looked like a deconstructed martini glass and something. And how is that Judaica? It didn't, there were no recognizable places to put candles. There was not, it didn't follow any, I mean, Amy talks about the requirement for how much wine you need in the Kiddush cup and all these, this has nothing. You said it changes shape. That's great. I mean, as a piece of sculpture, I think that's fine. But how is that? Because somebody says, oh, this is a Hanukkah, but it's not by any definition. I mean, it's a very interesting piece, but it's not, I don't think it's Judaica. I don't understand the definition of Judaica, if that's what it is.
Well, it has depressions in it for 8 candles and a shamash. I don't know if I can get back to it fast enough. Let's see.
If I could just say one thing while we're looking for that. It could very well be, a kosher menorah. In some ways, there are shockingly, there's incredible volumes of Jewish law associated with different objects. But for many objects, some things are simply tradition. Like, for example, I did a menorah in which the shamash was just barely above the other candles. And actually, an Orthodox rabbi told me that it just has to be distinguished. It actually does not need to be higher. So that opens up a whole world. And just because traditionally we've had it higher or there's been a certain arrangement, you could play with ideas of the two schools of thought that you should light from right to left or right, left to right. There are, endless Talmudic debates about that. So there's actually a surprising degree of freedom in many objects, and some of it's just been a sort of tradition.
I'm sorry, there was
Okay, so let me walk you through this piece and then tell you about how we discussed this at the Jewish Museum. So this is functional. This is the shamash. There is a hole in the top for candle, and there's a hole here, 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 and 3 candle holders here. I think I've got to 8 and 9. So there are places to put candles. So it is something that you can light. So it's functional, correct? It functions, and you can light the proper number of candles. The question that you have is it because they're not arranged in a particular way, how could this be a Hanukkah lamp? So I wrote a book on Hanukkah lamps, and I researched all the traditions related to it. And in fact, the Talmud only says that the lights of a Hanukkah lamp need to look distinct from each other. You can have them in the round, you can put them in a bowl, but to make them distinct, you should put something on top of the bowl so that each of the lights look different. We commissioned a Hanukkah lamp from Karim Rashid a number of years ago, and he made one where the lights were all kind of scrambled. And although there was a shamash that was slightly higher and different. So we went to the Jewish Theological Seminary and we said, is this kosher? He said, it's according to the Shulchan Aruch, the Ashkenazi tradition. The Shulchan Aruch is a major legal a compendium written by Joseph Caro in the 16th century, a Sephardi rabbi. And 70 years later, and he said it was fine. He repeated what was in the Talmud. A Hanukkah lamp only has to have the lights not looking like a bonfire is basically what they say. And but the Germanic tradition was stricter. And he said, look, it's much easier to make it not look like a bonfire if you just line the lights up all next to each other. And then you should make the shamash a little different in some way. So that's what our tradition is based on today. And in fact, I looked at all the Hanukkah lamps that have been made in the Sephardi tradition and the Mizrahi tradition and the Ashkenazi, and most of them prefer to do it that way with the lights all in a line. But it's not necessarily required. And so if somebody wants to step out of that tradition, with the Rashid lamp, I lit the light, and they all looked distinct. And so, according to the Jewish Theological Seminary, it was usable. So, there's tradition, and there's law, and there's custom. And these are artists who are, as I said, in the 80s, they were looking to break out of those traditions and make things that are different. So that's the answer. As far as I'm concerned, this is quite functional as a Hanukkah lamp. It has the right number of lights, and the lights don't have to be in a row. So it is, but you're right, it's definitely sculptural, and that was the point, that this artist always crosses the boundaries between functional and sculpture.
So I think halachically it's good, sure, but I think this is a simulated Hanukkah.
Absolutely. And there are some, and this is the point. Who are we making these things for? The Orthodox, who are the people who feel that this is not their tradition, then this is not for them. But there's so many out there who, for whatever reason, don't follow that tradition, and so why not? As I said, I I went to Hebrew school. I had a bat mitzvah of a sort, but I was never trained that, because I was conservative and didn't have that education, that the lights should all be all in a row when I came to this museum. And we've had multiple debates about it in our acquisition committee from people who just felt it wasn't right, but we feel that we want to represent all traditions here, and we want to represent where people are going and thinking and how they're thinking now, and all different levels of tradition and education. So that's what we do here.
Maybe that's a great place to end for this evening, unless anyone has one last question, but I think that's a lovely note to end on. Anyone? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight.